Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Although I haven't been making videos for long, I have been watching videos on YouTube for many years. Critical video essays made by YouTube media critics have always attracted my attention and been favourites of mine. I have been actively enjoying YouTube critic videos from at least 2010, and during the years from then to now, I have seen things change on Critic YouTube. In the past, concerns about politics and the politicisation of media weren't at the forefront of most critics' minds. There were, of course, a few complaints about political correctness and social justice creeping into films and computer games, and there were some scuffles with overly zealous social justice warriors. But it wasn't deemed a major issue by most YouTube critics. But this quickly changed during the 2010s. More overtly progressive media were made, and gaming journalism embraced progressivism as its ideology, along with less than respectable journalistic practices. But what I think alerted large numbers of people online to the progressive/woke ideology was the takeover of old brands and franchises. In the 2010s, Hollywood and the film industry decided that reboots, sequels, prequels, spin-offs, and remakes were the future, and filmmakers set to work creating new media within existent franchises. However, the majority of these filmmakers weren't the original creators, weren't very good at writing, and most were die-hard progressives, so of course, their creations reflected their beliefs and their skills at creativity. Audiences were subjected to poorly written films with blatant political messages, which were often shoved down the throat of the viewer for good measure. YouTube critics who didn't like the progressive political messages and the quality of the writing then shared their opinions about these media, only to discover they were now ists, phobes, and bigots. It didn't matter how moderate, how tame, how polite, or how accurate the criticism was. If you criticised a progressive artwork, you were a bad person. This resulted in a number of YouTube critics seeing bad writing and progressivism as interlinked, because they appeared together so frequently. And coming back to the here and now, critic videos can be found everywhere on YouTube, lamenting wokeness and reminiscing about the good old days when media weren't overflowing with contemporary politics and poorly constructed woke propaganda, with terrible plots and characters to boot. Anti-woke YouTube critics want media without woke lecturing from progressives, and believe a good way to convince people that said lecturing doesn't belong in media is to demonstrate how woke plots and characters are poorly constructed. Of course, there are YouTube critics who are completely on board with the state of current media, because they hold progressive political beliefs. So there are two factions in Critic YouTube, and these two factions are both rather broad tents. There is Progressive Critic YouTube, and there is Anti-Progressive/Anti-Woke Critic YouTube. Although there are no strict delineations, I would say there is more agreement among the members of Progressive Critic YouTube than there is among those of Anti-Woke Critic YouTube. But that is neither here nor there. What is here and there is that these two sides exist, and bump heads often enough to remind everyone of the fact. And this is what I want to discuss. Critic YouTube has a problem. Anti-woke Critic YouTube has a problem which relates to Progressive Critic YouTube. Progressive YouTube critics, and creators, are making one type of argument, while anti-woke YouTube critics are making another. The problem is quite particular. Progressive creators and critics always make moral arguments to support their creative decisions, while anti-woke YouTube critics often make arguments about writing to attack these same decisions. Or put more simply, progressives often argue about the moral ought, while anti-SJWs argue about the writing ought. Progressives are keenly interested in an artwork's substance, while anti-woke YouTube critics are keenly interested in an artwork's form. This is an observation I have had for maybe 2 years, and I could give a number of both small and large examples of this problem, but it was put into sharp relief for me after listening to a live stream hosted by Smudboy, which was a reaction to a video essay made by Renegade Cut. I should back up a bit and explain the context. Renegade Cut made a video called She-Ra is Good, actually, in which he made the case that the new She-Ra series, She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, is something children should watch. Although I have watched only a little of Renegade Cut's content, he is a self-described leftist, and so is a progressive of some stripe, and this was presumably why Smudboy Literature Devil and an author by the name of B. Malachi Dunn decided to respond to his video. I should clarify as well that my choice to use this livestream as an example of what is wrong with Critic YouTube is not because I have something against Smudboy, Literature Devil, or Dun. The opposite is true, and I actually enjoy Smudcast more than Every Frame a Pause. And it is not because they are guiltier than other YouTube critics. I am discussing this specific livestream because it is relatively recent, stuck out to me, and is a good example of the problem I wish to explicate. Hyperlinks for both Renegade Cut's essay and the livestream will be in the description box below. I highly recommend watching Renegade Cut's essay, and either watching or listening to the livestream before continuing with this essay. So what was Renegade Cut's main argument? Renegade Cut argued that children's television needs to teach children morals, and needs to help them understand the real world as it exists today. He argued She-Ra and the Princesses of Power does just that, and praised several aspects of the show, two of which were quite prominent. The first was the two homosexual couples in the show, one of which is a male homosexual couple that raised a main character called Bo, and the second was a talking unicorn Pegasus crossbreed called Swiftwind. I am paraphrasing, but Renegade Cut said the inclusion of the homosexual couples was good, because it would help homosexual children understand that their sexual feelings and desires were not bad, and because it would help teach heterosexual children that being homosexual is not bad as well. His praise of Swiftwind was elicited by the equestrian character's mission to free horses from farms and stables, and to tear down unjust hierarchies. Renegade Cut argued that this character would help children understand that oppressive hierarchies need to be destroyed, and violence might be necessary to reach such an end. He also argued that Swiftwind not only wants to tear down unjust hierarchies, but also has a clear idea of what he will replace them with, and so this character will help children better understand politics, especially revolutionary politics. The latter point of praise would be a good place for an excellent discussion, calm or heated, and it was discussed at some length by Smudboy, Literature Devil, and Dun. But what interested me was the discussion around the homosexual couples in She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, which took place between 1 hour, 3 minutes, 31 seconds, and 1 hour, 47 minutes, 25 seconds during the live stream. In the live stream, Smudboy, Literature Devil, and Dun became quite attentive when they saw the homosexual couples. Almost upon first seeing the male homosexual couple in the essay and hearing Renegade Cut spiel, Smudboy paused the video and made to rewind it so they could do a double take. The trio then spent some time talking about the representation of homosexual couples in She-Ra and the representation of sexuality in children's media in general. There were two main responses to the male homosexual characters, two different approaches which were epitomised by Smudboy and Literature Devil. Smudboy did what he does best, and asked whether this made any sense. He asked whether the homosexual characters belonged in the fictional world, and how homosexual characters had children. Essentially, Smudboy wanted to know whether these creative choices made sense in the world created by the writers, or whether it was bad writing motivated by political beliefs. This is what I'll call, for the purposes of this essay, the creative coherency approach, and it is where a critic considers whether the writing makes sense and is well constructed, and only mentions the author occasionally to discuss a point relating to the integrity and structure of the story. It is an approach concerned with the form of an artwork. Smudboy and Mauler used this approach frequently, as all critics worth their salt should. Smudboy also argued the series should have shown or told the audience how the two men got a boy to raise as their son. Literature Devil didn't use the creative coherency approach. Instead, he took a parental concern approach. He argued that including homosexual couples in She-Ra was unfair to parents, because parents don't want their children exposed to overt expressions of sexuality too early. He was quick to emphasise that parents didn't want their children exposed too early to any type of sexuality, either homosexual or heterosexual. He argued that shows, such as She-Ra, would expose children to sexuality, and force parents to have discussions they don't want to have with their children at that age. He also asked how many children from the ages of 8 to 10 know for sure they are homosexual, and whether the appearance of homosexual couples in She-Ra was even necessary for the reasons Renegade Cut proposed. The trio actually talked about Literature Devil's points for an extended period of time, and then discussed how they wouldn't show their children series such as Berserk or Castlevania, because they were violent and overtly sexual. They also continued to talk about how all the children's shows they had watched were not overly violent, did not contain profane language, and were not overtly sexual. Although both Smudboy and Literature Devil approached She-Ra from different perspectives, or, if you prefer, used different lenses to interpret the content of the video, they were both concerned about the appearance of homosexual couples in a show made for children. This can be inferred from the fact that the trio spent over 30 minutes talking about both the homosexual couples in She-Ra and matters concerned with sexual representation in children's television shows. Smudboy seemed concerned because it didn't make sense to him, while Literature Devil seemed concerned because he thought it wasn't fair for parents. Smudboy did not appear to be arguing against the appearance of these couples in the show, but Literature Devil seemed to be implicitly arguing that these homosexual couples shouldn't have been in She-Ra. As little as 4 years ago, I would have likely praised Smudboy and Literature Devil for their arguments and considered them quite sound. But today I must be honest and admit that I am deeply unimpressed by these responses. In fact, I would go so far as to say these arguments were utterly useless in the context of Renegade Cut's arguments. The problem with Smudboy's questions is the show seems to answer them, albeit not in a direct fashion. Smudboy asked whether the homosexual couples made sense in the show, and whether such expressions of homosexuality were accepted in the fictional world. Now, I have not watched She-Ra, but after watching Renegade Cut's video, and listening to what he said about the show, it would appear such things are normal, or at least accepted, in the world of She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. The very presence of the homosexual couples is testament to this fact, and it doesn't need explanation. It's not hard to understand that homosexual individuals exist, and, if society allows, they will act on their sexual urges. The world of She-Ra is not much different from the Western world in this regard. So Smudboy's questions about whether the writing supports the existence of these couples are answered. In the affirmative. There are no writing arguments which can be made against the presence of these homosexual couples in this fantasy world, because it seems to have been built to accommodate them. Also, his contention that it needed to be shown or explained how the male homosexual couple got a boy to raise as their son really isn't true, because audience members living in the Western world, who are the target audience, have all read news stories about how homosexual couples have managed to get children. The writers can already count on Western audience members knowing about homosexual parents, surrogate mothers, and adoption centres. Children might be less aware of these, but they can ask their parents about it. More on that later. Let us now consider the issues with Literature Devil's critique. The issue with Literature Devil's first argument, and I don't think he realises it, is it has an inbuilt double standard. Literature Devil's argument hinges on the fact that parents don't want their children exposed to any overt displays of sexuality. Now, Literature Devil never defined what an overt display of sexuality, either heterosexual or homosexual, would be in his book. But I can use my imagination, and I do agree here. After all, most parents don't want to discover their children watching Game of Thrones when they come back from work, for instance. But it is strange Literature Devil even raised this point in the context of Renegade Cut's She-Ra video essay, because the representations of homosexuality in these clips are really tame, or in other words, not overt. There isn't even kissing, and Literature Devil stated at the beginning of the live stream that he had not seen the show, so he only had these clips to judge whether the homosexuality present in She-Ra was overt or not. And to clarify, while the couples are obviously homosexual, their acts of affection are not overt or explicit. This makes the later discussion about how children's series don't have overt sexual representations, either heterosexual or homosexual, completely irrelevant, both to Renegade Cut's essay and She-Ra. The whole conversation at that stage was barely related to the issues Renegade Cut was discussing, or the homosexual couples in She-Ra themselves. It was almost as if Smudboy, Literature Devil, and Dunn had seen these homosexual couples having sex, and were trying to explain why no creator should include such scenes in a children's television series. If these two homosexual couples were heterosexual, I doubt Literature Devil would have felt a need to state the rather obvious fact that most parents don't want their children exposed to overt displays of sexuality. As well, I doubt Renegade Cut would have even mentioned these couples in his essay, and I highly doubt as well that a diatribe on how children's series are not, and should not be overtly sexual, would have taken place on the live stream. I am unsure whether Smudboy, Literature Devil, and Dunn are even aware of this, but they seem to perceive homosexual couples as being more overtly sexual than heterosexual ones. I cannot read minds, but I believe this must be the case, because I cannot imagine such arguments and tirades taking place on a live stream if this tame representation of a homosexual couple were a tame representation of a heterosexual couple instead. But to be fair, this is not the full extent of Literature Devil's argument. The second part which accompanied the first needs consideration. It is true, some parents don't want to have discussions about homosexuality with their young children, and they certainly don't want children's television prompting conversations about sexuality. Shows like She-Ra, Literature Devil has argued, will inevitably force those conversations, as children who are already familiar with heterosexuality will be puzzled by homosexuality, with which they are not familiar. This is true, but Renegade Cut raised a point, which I shall reformulate into a question. Is it too adult or difficult to explain the existence of homosexual couples to children? This is a question I, in the spirit of critique, am inclined to ask as well. How difficult would it be, for instance, for a mother to say to her daughter, "You know how your father and I are a couple? Well, a man and a woman can be a couple, but two men or two women can also be a couple of sorts." Now, this is not a comprehensive answer, but it would likely satisfy the child. Of course, the daughter would likely have other questions, but if it started to reach adult territory, the mother could easily reply, "I'll tell you when you're older." Moreover, parents, by virtue of being parents, will sometimes have to discuss topics and themes they do not want to discuss with their children. Children have open eyes and open ears, and when they cannot understand something, they ask innocent questions. So one could ask why creators should worry if their media start uncomfortable conversations. After all, different parents consider different conversations uncomfortable and want to avoid different subjects with their children. It varies from parent to parent. Just how many topics and subjects should creators and artists try to avoid? Which conversations should creators try to avoid starting in family households? And for what reasons should they try avoiding these subjects? As well, the creators of She-Ra might respond to Literature Devil's parental concerns with this counsel. If you don't want to have these conversations with your children, why don't you show them the children's media you grew up with instead of our show? All the children's media you grew up watching didn't have homosexual couples and won't start these conversations. Parents aren't passive agents. They do have some control over what media their children watch. Literature Devil's second argument is a non-argument. Literature Devil asked how many young children, between the ages of 8 to 10, know for a fact they are homosexual, and the obvious answer is very few, and he said this as a counter to Renegade Cut's argument that the show would be beneficial to homosexual children. The problem is, this argument, really a question, doesn't demonstrate how Renegade Cut is wrong. Yes, it is true, only a tiny number of children at that age will know for sure they are not heterosexual, but that minuscule number probably still exists. So if you accept Renegade Cut's premise that it is alright for homosexuals to act on their desires, then you cannot argue against the appearance of these homosexual couples on this basis, because these couples will help reassure homosexual children that their desires are not bad. Furthermore, if the normalization and promotion of homosexual relationships isn't wrong, why would it be a problem if the vast majority of heterosexual or uninterested children is exposed to a show which is trying to normalize and promote homosexual relationships, particularly homosexual parenting? Listening to the live stream again, I forgot to discuss a dismissal, which preceded Literature Devil's second argument, and this was a dismissal initially made by Smudboy. As stated before, Renegade Cut argued that the homosexual couples in the show would help reassure homosexual children. He argued that these children need representation in shows like She-Ra and The Princesses of Power. Smudboy responded to Renegade Cut's argument about homosexual representation with the statement, "I don't get it." Literature Devil and Dunn concurred. Literature Devil thought it was ridiculous, and asked when the panel had felt comforted or reassured after watching a film or show which had heterosexual characters and heterosexual romances. To be honest, I find it strange that Smudboy, Literature Devil and Dunn didn't understand this argument. Let us consider some demographics. Great Britain, as of the 1st of September 2020, has a population size of about 68 million, according to WorldOMeter. Now, according to the Office of National Statistics, in 2017, an estimated 93.2% of the British population identified as heterosexual or straight, and an estimated 2% identified as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Now, the percentages are unlikely to have changed a great deal since 2017, so the percentage of LGBT people in Great Britain is still going to hover around the 2 to 3% numbers. And according to Gallup, in 2017, about 4.5% of the American population identified as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. So this means there are very few homosexual and bisexual individuals living in both Great Britain and the United States of America. So most homosexual individuals in most communities are going to be the odd ones out. Let us imagine a somewhat hypothetical situation involving a homosexual boy. A boy who may watch shows like She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. He may not be bullied or abused, but he is likely to feel left out. All his friends are very likely to be straight, and the cultural and societal norms of his community will be built around supporting and promoting heterosexual relationships. And most of the media he'll have viewed and interacted with will represent heterosexual romances, rather than homosexual ones. He is sure to ask himself if his sexual and romantic desires are normal and where he fits in his community and society. So for this boy, a show which represents homosexual characters such as himself will be reassuring. A similar thing is at play for the boy raised by two men or two women, since both those setups are extremely rare and are not the norm. Now let's switch this around. Let's imagine a society where homosexuality is the norm, and heterosexuality is about as common as homosexuality in today's world. Let's leave aside any issues about how people reproduce in this society. Now, let's imagine a heterosexual boy in this society. He may not be bullied or abused, but he is guaranteed to feel almost the same things as the homosexual boy in our last hypothetical situation. So if he turns on a show and sees heterosexual representation, he is likely to feel comforted and reassured. The reason why heterosexual individuals don't feel comforted and reassured when they are represented in media is because not only is their representation ubiquitous, but also because basically every person in their life will be straight. Virtually all the people they meet in the street will be heterosexual as well. For these reasons, heterosexual individuals don't desire reassurance or comfort from media, because their cultures, media and communities, have been supportive of heterosexuality for, well, forever. But at the end of the day, this doesn't even matter. Let's concede the argument and pretend that all progressive arguments about representation are completely bogus, and there is not a shred of truth in any of them. This dismissal still isn't a strong argument against the presence of these homosexual couples, and neither is it an argument which properly demonstrates how and why these homosexual couples are poorly written and don't belong in the show. What if the creators of the show turned around and said to Smudboy, Literature Devil and Dunn, "You're right, these homosexual couples are not going to comfort or reassure any non-heterosexual children. Our theories on the importance of representation in media are completely and fundamentally wrong. But we as creators wanted to include a few homosexual couples in our show for, well, reasons. We thought it would be interesting and fun to do it." How could Smudboy, Literature Devil and Dunn effectively argue against this, following their previous lines of argument? So on balance, the arguments made by Smudboy and Literature Devil against the presence/writing of these homosexual couples in She-Ra and the Princesses of Power are hardly strong. If these were the only arguments which existed in the universe against the presence/writing of the homosexual couples in She-Ra, then I would be forced to concede the debate and join the progressives because their arguments would be the stronger. The problem is these arguments simply don't demonstrate how or why the writing is bad. Furthermore, can I say what this must look like to the progressive or random internet surfer? What this livestream must look like to any progressive who watches it? A progressive or internet surfer who watches this livestream will likely conclude that Smudboy, Literature Devil, and Dunn are not expressing their true feelings about homosexual characters in fiction, and he will likely think that Smudboy, Literature Devil, and Dunn are dishonest men who hide their real opinions behind contrived non-arguments. I am fully aware Smudboy said they didn't personally care that the couples were homosexual, but is any wandering progressive or internet surfer likely to believe this when the appearance of these homosexual characters was the start of a long negative discussion? Now, I'm sure if Smudboy, Literature Devil, and Dunn were to watch this video, they would likely make many thoughtful objections to my assessment of their arguments, and I can imagine one extra argument they might present about the appearance of the homosexual couples in this series. And I think it would go something like this. Listen, Penguin, we aren't against the appearance of homosexual characters in media, but we dislike it when these things are overtly political. Preachy politics are ham-fisted, and are the hallmarks of bad writing. Indeed, Smudboy said they didn't personally care that the couples were homosexual, and Literature Devil said that anime series are great at including homosexual characters without making it political. One of Literature Devil's complaints was the male homosexual couple in She-Ra was being placed front and centre, and the creators were making their homosexuality a focus, to use his words. Now, I'm inclined to agree with the argument. Politics is hard to do correctly in fiction, without coming across as preachy or manipulative. As well, I agree with Literature Devil that homosexual characters in anime series, the ones I have seen anyway, are not political statements by and large, and are not made a focus. However, watching Renegade Cut's video and listening to his description of these homosexual men and the episode in question, I find it hard to say that the creators were somehow making their existence a grand focus for political purposes. Although, to be sure, their presence is political and woke. In a number of shows, there are Meet the Parents or Meet the Family episodes for a character or two, and this is often done for character development purposes. Whenever such an episode appears in a series, the focus is on two things. First, the parents/siblings/other relatives of the established character, and second, the established character. So Literature Devil is right, that these homosexual men are a focus, but they are not a focus because they are homosexual. They are the focus of this episode because they raised Bo. They are his family, and this is a Meet the Family episode. If they were heterosexual, they would also be the focus of the episode. As well, since these homosexual men are not expressing their feelings for each other inappropriately, I hardly think it is fair to claim the creators were making it a focus because they wanted to lecture their audience or shove it in their faces. Yes, these creators have an agenda and a message, but most creators do, whether it be right-wing, centre-wing, left-wing, or whatever. The focus of discussion, therefore, should not be on whether an artwork should have a message, but on whether that message is true and whether it is well written. And this brings me to my final point, because I want to discuss the real problem with these arguments. The real problem is, Smudboy's questions and Literature Devil's arguments are mostly irrelevant as far as progressives are concerned, because they miss the point. Earlier, I outlined the reasons why Renegade Cut liked the homosexual couples in the new She-Ra series. I remember listening to the livestream and immediately recognising that Renegade Cut was making moral arguments for why the show was good. Smudboy complained in the livestream that Renegade Cut didn't mention the plot in his video, but the reason Renegade Cut did not mention it is because it wasn't his primary concern, and it may not have been the primary concern of the writers either. The primary concern was morality. Progressive morality. Why were there homosexual couples in She-Ra? Why weren't all the couples heterosexual? These couples were homosexual because the progressives who wrote the show thought it was morally good to help normalise and promote homosexuality and homosexual parenting. If I met and asked the writers why they wrote homosexual couples into the show, they would probably respond with something like this. There's nothing wrong with homosexual relationships, but there are people who believe that there is something wrong with them. By including these homosexual couples in the show, we hope to normalise and promote homosexual relationships to young children, and to inoculate them against this wrong opinion. And by doing this, we hope to change the culture. Thus, Smudboy and Literature Devil's arguments concerning the homosexual couples do nothing to refute this position or challenge this agenda. It is either moral to promote and normalise homosexual relationships and parenting, or it is immoral. If it is moral to do so, then there is no real reason to complain about the presence of the homosexual characters. None whatsoever. Whether media should promote and normalise homosexual relationships and parenting is not a writing issue. It is a moral issue. Now, some would argue that this is incorrect. Some would say the normalisation and promotion of homosexual relationships and parenting is not a moral issue at all, but instead a completely subjective issue. This is a position genuinely held by relativists and nihilists, who do not believe there are any objective or absolute moral standards. But most people are not relativists or nihilists, and I cannot think of one single YouTube critic who is a consistent relativist or nihilist. Just because someone makes nihilist or relativist arguments doesn't mean he follows those arguments to their logical conclusions. But most people who claim something is morally neutral or subjective actually mean the thing isn't immoral in and of itself, or that it does no evil, not that morality isn't a concern. Because to claim something isn't a moral issue is to make a moral judgment, and thus appeal to some standard of morality. Most people in Western societies don't think it is immoral to enter homosexual relationships, and therefore they don't perceive it as a moral issue. But that doesn't mean they haven't made any moral judgments on the thing in question. After all, they have judged it isn't immoral, and thus not something to be concerned about. So unless one is a genuine relativist or nihilist, the normalisation and promotion of homosexuality in media will be a moral issue on some level. So let's continue. Even if some minor/small parts of the writing for She-Ra and the Princesses of Power were terrible, even if the form of the artwork were poorly constructed so that the presence of these homosexual couples made no sense, there would still be little reason to complain so verbosely and so loudly. Let's pretend for a minute that the presence of these characters makes no sense in this show because of the writing. Are a few poorly written homosexual characters who only appear in a couple of episodes in a Netflix show which has 5 seasons worth of episodes enough to ruin an entire series? Most shows which number more than one season have bad or less than excellent episodes, which viewers tend to shrug off so long as they don't have story-altering consequences for the rest of the series. For example, most fans consider the Great Divide episode in Avatar: The Last Airbender to be the worst episode in the entire show, but it isn't an important episode. So while it isn't the best episode, it doesn't ruin the entire show for most viewers, and most people don't complain about or criticise the Great Divide at length. If the Great Divide were an important episode and greatly affected the rest of the series, fans would complain about it more often. If these homosexual characters were poorly written, plot integral, and appeared in every episode, they would certainly ruin the entire series. But since they don't seem to be poorly written, and since they don't appear in every episode, surely ignoring them should be easy enough. Heck, it is probably possible to skip the episode where Beau's homosexual family is introduced, without missing any important plot points. On the other hand, though, if it is immoral to promote and normalise homosexual relationships and parenting, then it is irrelevant whether the writing is good or not. Or put another way, it doesn't matter whether the form of the art is good or not. It is promoting immorality, and can be criticised for this reason. If it is immoral as well, it makes sense to complain loudly about the normalisation and promotion, and not just ignore it, because media do influence culture, and do help individuals form their opinions and worldviews, and I think everyone can agree that an artwork should not promote something which is immoral. Now hopefully, the problem I mentioned near the start of this essay is becoming clear. Progressives are concerned with the moral ought. Their creative decisions are influenced by their ideology and its system of morality. They believe what they are doing is virtuous and good. Their justification for many of their chosen creative decisions is that they are going to help make the world a better place. In other words, their creative decisions are inherently moral, and are thus inherently good. The progressives are making moral arguments in support of their work, and anti-progressive YouTube critics are responding by arguing about the writing ought. Progressives and anti-progressives are speaking past each other, and this is a titanic problem which appears to be endemic in Critic YouTube. There is a moral debate happening on Critic YouTube right now, but only the progressives have decided to show up. If, and this is predicated on a big if If anti-woke YouTube critics want to convince progressives to stop putting social justice messages in their stories, if they want to persuade people browsing the web that progressive messages don't belong in fiction, and if they want to make counter-arguments which progressives will have to take seriously, then they must move beyond arguments about form and move on to arguments about morality. It is not enough to make arguments about plot structure and characterization. Arguments must be made against the core beliefs and presuppositions held by progressives. For example, if you don't want homosexual characters being promoted and normalized in children's fiction, it is no good trying to claim the writing is bad or some parents will be unhappy with it, because to do only this is to concede that there is nothing inherently wrong with the progressives' agenda. You have to bite the bullet and challenge the very notion that it is good to promote and normalize homosexuality. Progressives are saying homosexual relations should be normalized and promoted, and the only appropriate response is a principled, they should not be. Anything else doesn't address their contention and is just details. Of course, this is based on a big if. Perhaps the majority of YouTube critics has no moral objection to woke or progressive messages. Perhaps they agree with progressives on most things, but just don't like preachy politics and bad writing. If that is the case, fair enough. I'm certainly not suggesting that people argue against their own moral positions, nor am I suggesting that people should jump into debates for which they are either A. uncomfortable, B. unprepared, or C. uninterested. However, to not point this out would be negligent of me. Progressives, whether one likes it or not, are not discussing how to create stories with well-written plots or characters. What they are discussing is how to make media that help achieve ends which they consider moral. They are also interested in determining which art is moral, and how to create artworks with progressive morals. They might fail at creating media which don't alienate crowds of people and writing stories without plot holes, but they are having conversations about art on a plane higher than most YouTube critics. And while a critic can choose not to enter that plane, and instead focus solely on the form of art, it does mean he won't have anything worth adding to the discussion which the progressives are happily dominating. As well, if said critic is opposed to a progressive agenda which he sees in fiction, he won't be able to argue against it if he remains focused solely on art form. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all have an excellent day.